As you can no doubt tell by the stack of devices here on my desk, I've got a huge amount to talk to you about today, and this review is going to be a combination of what I'd say is kind of a little bit of bad news, a little bit of good news, and hopefully lots and lots of information to help you potentially make a decision about your next DAC. Specifically, what we're talking about today are the various versions of the J2 DAC from Geshelli Labs. And that means that we've got the original ESS version of the J2. We've also got the AKM version and the AKM socketed version, although I'm kind of addressing those as one DAC. I'll talk about that shortly. But then we've also got the brand new, yet to be released but soon to be released, J2 AKM version, but using the AK4499 DAC chip. And I'll talk about exactly what all that means. The good news is it's not as complicated as it may sound when I'm talking about these. There's really actually just one J2 you can order now, but you can order it with the ESS chip or two different AKM chips. It's all modular, it's all optional. You can build it up exactly how you want it to be. And so my job here today is to guide you through the process of choosing what may or may not be the best choice for you. And so let's not delay, let's jump straight in and let me explain the full J2 range and which parts of the J2 range I think are fantastic and which parts maybe aren't so fantastic. As we get into this review, there's a couple of things that I'd like to flag. The first one is to say a huge thanks to Gino and Sherry and the rest of the Geshelli Labs team for sending me out the J2s. I also want to flag up front that the links in the description down below through to Geshelli Labs to buy these are affiliate links, but as you'll see in just a second, that doesn't mean I'm going to tell you to rush out and buy these products necessarily, because I think they're going to suit some people and maybe not some others. Or at least certain variants might suit some people and not suit others. The other thing that I want to flag is that there is a lot of ground to cover today, and so I'm going to use, as always, chapter markers down below. If you want to jump to a certain section, if you're just here, for instance, to hear about the new AK4499 chip, then you can use the chapter markers to jump forwards to that point. But do be aware there's some information I'm going to be sharing up front, which is common to all of these, so you may want to stick around for the intro before you jump ahead to the end. And with that in mind, let's get into the details. As I mentioned just a moment ago, even though I've said that there's all these different variants of the J2, what that actually really translates to is the fact that there is one J2 DAC with multiple modular options. When you go to the Geshelli Labs website, if you're looking at their DAC, they've only got one listed option, and that's the J2. But if you click on the J2 DAC, what you'll then find is that you can choose to upgrade the op amps. You can also choose now which DAC chip you're going to use, whether it's the ESS, the AKM, or the new AK4499 from AKM. And so part of that means there's a bit of a challenge for me in telling you what the prices of these are. But what I'll say straight away is that if you're looking for just the bog standard base model version of the J2 AKM, that'll be the AK4493, then you're looking at a DAC worth about $260. So it's a very comfortable entry point for a really high quality DAC. Now I say high quality based on the fact that I've reviewed in the past the J2 ESS version and it was a solid DAC. It doesn't blow me away, it doesn't sort of set a new benchmark or beat other DACs at around the same price point, but it competes toe to toe with most of them. Coming into this review, I'd had lots and lots of requests for me to review the AKM version of the J2, and that's the AK4493 version. And so I was really interested to see, first of all, whether or not the AK4493 version was better than the original ESS version. I should also mention at this point that the ESS version is only available in the unsocketed version of the J2, and I should also mention there that the unsocketed version, which is now available as the ESS or the AK4493, is $250 versus $260 for what's called the socketed version. Now I know there's lots of different terms and versions and models flying around, so let me try and make this really clear early on. If you go to the Geshelli Labs website and you look at the J2, you're going to see that there's a regular J2 and the J2S, which is for J2 socketed. What that means is that if you're buying the regular J2, it's not a modular DAC in the sense that you can't change anything once you get it. And then all you can do with it is choose whether you get the ESS chip or the AK4493 chip. After that, you're going to get yourself a DAC. You can, of course, customize the case and the aesthetics of it, but beyond that, the actual device itself, the circuitry inside, is going to be exactly the same based on what you choose. It's never going to change, in other words. However, if you want to spend the extra $10 and get the socketed version, that opens up all sorts of extra options. What that's then going to mean is that you can choose which DAC chip you have, whether it's the AK4493 or the new AK4499 when it's released officially by Geshelli. And then you can also choose which op amps to get. And I'm going to talk through that in just a moment, but I wanted to clarify we've got the standard J2, which gives you ESS or AKM 4493. Then you've got the socketed J2, which gives you the AK4493 or the AK4499, as well as the choice of op amps. And as I said, I'm going to keep explaining this. We'll talk it through. It'll all fall into place for you soon if it doesn't already. And so let's talk now about the different upgrades and what they're going to cost you. And to do that, I'm going to take the socketed AKM version here that I've got. I've removed 4 of the screws at the back before I started this video. And if I just slide out this board here, what you can see as you look at this board is that we've now got on the circuit board these little green chips here. Now these are removable op amps. I can actually pop one of them out. So these are removable op amps. You can get the standard OPA 1656 op amps, which is what these are, or you get the larger and more complicated Sparkos Labs SS3602 op amps. Now I've reviewed the Sparkos Labs op amps on the channel before. I'm a huge fan of them. They're a fully discrete op amp, and that means they do things better than the integrated op amps like these, in the sense that they're going to give you a better, more refined sound, and also a greater sense of soundstage depth, and that's really key, as you'll hear in this review. Putting this op amp back in now, and it's worth knowing if you haven't played with op amps before, there's always some sort of indicator on the op amp as to which way around it goes. It could be a cutout on the bottom section near the pins, it could be a dot or a mark on top, but you just need to make sure you line them up properly, and beyond that, you just plug them in, make sure that obviously all the pins line up, but then just push it in once you've got it around the right way. So I'm going to put this one back in now, making sure I do it the right way. And so coming back now to the J2 AKM socketed, the improvements that you're getting, or the options you're getting by spending the extra $10 up front, is that you can now choose to have different op amps installed from the factory, from Geshelli, or you can choose to just take the stock OPA 1656 op amps and upgrade your own op amps later. And then the other thing that I haven't mentioned yet is that with all of the J2s, you can choose whether or not you're getting a USB enabled DAC. It does cost a bit more. From memory, it's $50. Sorry, I haven't got that in my notes. But it does mean that you can keep the price as low as possible if you don't need USB, if you don't need the upgraded op amps, or you can start to build up a DAC to be exactly what you want it to be. So it's a pretty cool opportunity here that you can really customize and tailor the J2 to be exactly what you want and spend as much or as little as you want, starting at that $250 price tag. If you do choose to go with the Sparkos Lab op amps, it's worth noting that you can actually choose to have them just for the RCAs and or just for the XLRs. So for example, if you were going to buy this and you knew that you were only buying it to go with a single headphone amp that's just, say, balanced connections XLR only, you might choose to only upgrade the XLR connections. What that means is you're going to get the standard OPA 1656 in the other one, let's say it's the RCA. And so that's another way you can reduce costs. You're not forced to put the Sparkos op amps, which are more expensive, in all sockets. You can just put it in the ones that make sense for you. And so if you're upgrading the RCA sockets, it's going to be $79 for the Sparkos upgrade. If you're upgrading the XLR, it's going to be $158 because you need 2 of them. And then if you want to upgrade both RCA and XLR, then it's just a combination of those, which brings you to, $237. And that's going to bring the total price of the AKM 4493 socketed version J2, lots of variables here I know, it's going to bring that up to a price of, checking my notes, $497. So it's still a sub $500 DAC, but it has kind of doubled the price from the base version J2. And so one of my first questions I wanted to go through here was, is it worth the upgrade? Which upgrades do make sense? Which upgrades don't make sense? And then from there, the one final question is, if you go over to the AK4499 chip version, which will be coming out soon, is that worth the upgrade as well? Now that version has all the same op amp capabilities that I've just talked about here. It's got the modular USB, everything's the same, it's the exact same DAC, but the difference is you are then going to also pay extra for the AK4499 chip. And the reason for that is it's a much more expensive chip. It's actually a dual chip design. It uses an AK4491 chip and an AK4499 chip, and they're working in parallel. Or actually not in parallel, technically they're in series because one does the digital side of the decoding, the other does the analog. And if you want to know more about exactly how the AK4499 is set up, I'm going to be interviewing Gino and Sherry from Geshelli Labs in the coming weeks. I haven't worked out yet if it's going to come out here on the channel or go to just the podcast. I'll make sure to add it in the description down below with links once it's available, but also make sure you check out the Passion for Sound podcast. It's a bit ad hoc at this stage, but I will continue to bring out episodes when it makes sense to do so. Coming back around now to the AK4499 chip, and I should mention that it's going to come out roughly around about $175 or $180 extra for the AK4499. That may sound like a big jump, but I'll talk through in a moment whether I think it's worth it, what the differences are, etc. The key thing that you need to know is it's up to you which version of this you try. So if we step back for a moment and just think about the whole range, you're starting at about $250 for a base model J2 no socketed version, so you can't change op amps. You can choose the ESS or the AKM version. It's then an extra $50 if you want USB capability, taking it up to a $300 DAC. And then you can scale all the way up to something like the J2 socketed with the Sparkos Labs op amps, but still just the AK4493 chips. And that's going to come in at just over $500 with USB. Probably about $550, I think it works out to be. Or then you can scale all the way up to $730 and get yourself the full version J2 AK4499 with Sparkos op amps and USB card. So as you can see, there's lots of different options here. I know it probably sounds complicated. I'm trying to explain it clearly, and I know I've taken a while to do that. But if you jump onto the website and just really quickly flick through, and I'll put that on screen as well, hopefully it all becomes really clear. So the key questions for this review are, is the J2 a good DAC in general? Is the AKM version better than the ESS? Do the Sparkos Labs op amps make a big difference to the sound? And should you spend the extra $180 to get the AK4499 version with or without the Sparkos Labs op amps? So there's lots and lots to cover. Let's dive in with a quick tour of the J2 in case you've never looked at one of these before. Picking up my ESS version of the J2 here because it's all screwed back together already. And what you can see as you look at the J2 is it's a fairly basic design. There's no extra knobs or buttons or displays. It's a very simple design. Some people are going to like that. Some people won't like that so much. But let me quickly talk you through what you get if you buy the J2. Now, before I get too deep into this, I should mention I've got here two versions with the aluminium and the Perspex front panel. That's the AKM socketed and the J2 regular ESS version. And these are exactly the same as what's in the wooden case over here, but the wooden cases are an additional extra if you want them. It's purely an aesthetic modification. The circuit board inside is identical to whatever model you might have in the aluminium, you can have in the wooden version as well. So as we talk now about the functionality and the connectivity of these, as you look at the front panel, things are pretty simple. We've got a power button, which with a long press switches the device on and off. With a short press, it cycles through the internal backlight for the front panel. We then go to an input button, which is going to cycle through the various inputs, and which input you're using is displayed via the little red LEDs on the front. They'll just cycle through, and the position of the LED that's on or off tells you which connection you're using. There's also a gain functionality, so you can actually run this through 3 different output levels by holding down the input button. And so that means if you do need to pull back on the output level of this one, you can do that, like I said, through 3 steps. And then as we move over to the right-hand side, we've got an optical input and a coaxial input. Now that's something that I know some people like, the fact that you can have the inputs on the front or the back of these. Others will never use these on the front and they're just going to sit there because they want the cables all hidden on the back. But the good news is you've got the versatility to do whatever you want to, because you've got these 2 on the front, but you've also got 2 more on the back. So again, starting from this end, we've got our USB socket. That's USB-B there. We've got the coaxial second socket and the optical second socket. So these are not identical sockets. These are 4 completely distinct inputs. So in total, you've actually got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different inputs into a J2, regardless of which version you buy. Once we get beyond the inputs, we've then got our outputs. And the J2 is going to output both RCA single-ended and XLR balanced. And then the final thing on the J2 is a 12-volt DC connector barrel. So you can run these with a linear power supply or a teeny tiny wall wart power supply supplied by Geshelli. And in my testing of these, you do get a slight upgrade using a linear power supply. I haven't taken the time to test each different variant to see if the linear power supply has more or less impact as you go up through the different specifications of the J2. but suffice to say, if you're spending up at the level of the AK4499 fully loaded, that's over the $700 mark now, then you may find a linear power supply is a worthwhile investment. At the lower levels though, the supplied wall wart is a really nice little power supply, and there's no reason in my opinion that you should go out and spend too much extra, if any extra, on an expensive linear power supply for these. And so with all that said, let's start talking now about the sound quality. I'm going to start by talking about whether or not the original ESS and the AK4493 are significantly different in sound quality. First and foremost, what I will say is that all of these are using Delta Sigma DAC chips. And what that's going to generally lead to is a fairly consistent sound in the sense that they're all going to be generally neutral. You're not going to find drastic shifts in tonality between any of these. They're all going to produce a fairly consistent and neutral sound. What you can expect to change as you move between different DACs, different implementations, different op-amps in the output stage, all those things, is you can expect potentially to find very subtle nuances between the sounds. As I said, this is not going to be a case of one is more neutral or one is more correct than the other. It's more about very subtle nuances in the character of the sound. Whether or not one's a little bit smoother on the top end, so same amount of treble, but whether one's smoother or a bit more textured or a bit harsher. Whether one of them seems to have better control over the bass, even though they're both going to have the same bass levels, because both of them, whether it's the ESS or the AKM, both of them are Delta Sigma DACs. It's going to be the filtering that's really changing between them, and that's going to slightly alter the sound. But if you've ever played with a DAC that has filter options, you'll know that those differences are always pretty subtle. And so kicking things off, as I said, I put the ESS up against the AKM AK4493. Of course, for this test, I was making sure I was using just the regular OPA 1656 op-amps, and I was running both of these into the Burson Soloist 3X GT. That was the 2023 version that I've just recently reviewed, and I was listening via the Mesa Elites. One of the first things that I noticed was that the AKM version seemed to put out just a little bit more output voltage than the ESS version, so I did have to keep fixing the volume to try to get them volume matched, and that did make comparisons a little bit more difficult. But I'd say that once the volumes were matched, there is a very, very, very subtle difference. It would have been a bit easier if I didn't have to volume match every time to pick out just how big the difference was, but it was one of those cases where I'm comfortable and confident that there is an audible difference, but I'm also very clear on the fact that that difference is tiny. I feel like the AK4493 DAC delivers just a little bit more weight in the mid-range. It doesn't mean that it's suddenly a thick or a warm DAC. As I said before, tonality is still pretty much the same. But I felt like the character of the mid-range was maybe a bit smoother, a bit sort of richer or fuller in a way through the mid-range, and that's probably overstating it. It's probably just a sense of a little bit more weight in the mid-range. And then I also feel like the treble and the upper registers from the AKM version had just a tiny bit more sense of detail and texture. But we're literally talking a 1 or 2% change here. And I'm also not sitting here saying that one is clearly and definitely better. I can absolutely see some people saying the ESS version's better, others saying the AK4493 is better, and others still saying that they can't hear a difference. It's at that level of difference where I think your source chain could limit what you can actually hear because the difference is so small. Also, your experience doing critical listening and things like that could mean that you try these out and you say no difference at all, and that's completely understandable. It's a very, very subtle difference. And that does lead me to a little bit of bad news about the AKM version, and that is that I was receiving lots of comments on other videos telling me how people like Cheap Audio Man and others were saying that the J2 AKM was absolutely the best DAC they'd tried at that sort of price point. There was no need to spend more money on a bigger, better DAC, and I have to say I don't agree with that. I'd already reviewed and liked the J2 ESS, but I also never thought that it really hit above its price point, and in some cases there are other DACs around the same price that I think do a better job. I think the AKM is a very, very incremental improvement over the original J2 ESS, and therefore I don't think it's redefining the category. It's a really solid, good quality DAC at the price point. It's very versatile with all the different inputs that it gives you, but at the same time I wouldn't be saying that this is the one to beat. It's one of the good solid options at around about that $300 price point. Having said that, if you were to ask me which of these two I would choose, I would definitely choose the AKM. Even though the differences were subtle, to my ears, for my preferences, I think the AKM does have the edge over the ESS. As I said before, I just think it's got that little bit more weight in the mid-range and a tiny bit more sense of texture and detail up top, and that for me meant that as I went back and forth, it was fairly intangible, but I just consistently enjoyed listening to the AKM version a little bit more. So I'd give the nod to this one, but as I said, it's really a subtle shift, and it's not enough to redefine the category. Now, in case you're sitting there right now screaming at the screen that the J2 AKM is way better than I'm giving it credit for and I've got no idea what I'm talking about, I did a comparison with another DAC at a slightly higher price point that I think is fantastic, and that's the EverSolo DAC-Z6. Because realistically, if this is as special a DAC as some people have claimed it to be, then it should absolutely be on the level of a higher tier DAC. And so I put the stock J2 AK4493 DAC, and what I mean by stock is that I didn't have the Sparkos op amps installed for this test. So I put the stock DAC here, which comes in at about $300 with the USB. I put that up against the EverSolo DAC-Z6, which comes in at $499, so a full $200 more than the J2. And what I'd say is that the EverSolo was very similar sounding to the J2. So that is a vote in the favour of the J2 AKM. But again, it's not to say that it's suddenly this world beater. The DAC-Z6 is a more expensive DAC, and the fact that these were very similar is a good sign for the J2. But what I found as I listened to The Devil's Trill by Sophie Ann Mutter was that there were things that I liked about the J2 AKM presentation and things that I liked about the DAC-Z6 presentation. For instance, I felt like that little bit of extra mid-range weight from the J2 was preferable. It was also a little bit smoother, or maybe you could say more refined in the top end. That's going to be debatable whether it's sort of rolled off in the detail compared to the EverSolo DAC-Z6, or whether it's just smoother or refined. But then on the flip side, there's a slightly what I'd call crunchy section of the music at about 8 minutes 40 in The Devil's Trill. And what I found was that when that section came in, the DAC-Z6 was able to better separate all the texture and the detail that was going on. And again, that's where I find that most Delta Sigma DACs anywhere up to about $1,000, as you spend more money from one to the next, you're getting very, very tiny improvements. And that's what I'm hearing here. I think the DAC-Z6 is resolving just a little tiny bit more detail. It is just a little bit better of a DAC, but whether it's worth $200 more, that's a whole other question. So I'm not for a second sitting here saying that people like Randy from Cheap Audio Man are wrong about liking the J2. I think it's a fantastic DAC. I just want to put the sort of expectations and the hype in check a little bit. I think it's a good, solid $300 DAC that maybe punches a little bit above its price point, but it's not redefining the segment, as I said before. And so with that said, let's now turn our attention to whether or not upgrading the op amps is the thing that's going to completely turn the tables on the rest of the market. What I was able to do for this test, and I'm going to pick up my trusty AKM socketed here. What I was able to do for this test was take the socketed version, which is now jammed in there. Let me just wiggle it out. And as you can see here, what I had set up was I had the Sparkos Labs op amp in the RCA section, and I had the OPA 1656s, that's the base model, you don't pay any extra for op amp, in the XLR stage. And I compared the difference between the two. Because what I wanted to know here was, is there actually a benefit for a Delta Sigma DAC in putting a high quality op amp in the output stage? I know that there's a benefit in using these high quality op amps in output stages of headphone amps, but does it have the same impact when doing it inside the DAC? And so my comparison here was just to simply switch between the RCA output and the XLR output and see what I heard. As I switched back and forth between the two, it was very clear there was a difference, but it wasn't actually as big of a difference as I hoped. I was expecting a bigger shift. I know how good the SS3602 op amp is, and so I was expecting a really significant shift in the sound, but I have to say, it didn't completely blow me away. Going to the SS3602, you do get a little bit more separation in the sound. I think the SS3602 also delivers a slightly smoother, more refined sound, but also extracts a little bit more detail. But I don't think it was a massive, massive leap. And to put that into a bit more context, what I found was that as I listened to the SS3602, where I found the benefits of it compared to the stock op amps was on high quality recordings and high quality systems. If I used it with a lower quality amplifier, lower quality headphones, or lower quality music, then the difference between the stock op amp and the Sparkos op amp became a bit less easy to pick. It was still there, but it was less obvious and evident. I would say that regardless of what I was listening to, whether it was lower end or higher end gear, better or worse recordings, I did always find the sound just intangibly more enjoyable from the SS3602. Because it is a bit more refined, it does deliver a slightly smoother sound whilst also extracting a bit more detail. It was consistently the version that I preferred listening to, but at the same time, it wasn't a huge leap. So whether or not you want to spend $80 or $160 or $240 odd to upgrade the op amps in here, and remember the reason I'm saying the different numbers is it's $79 if you just want the RCA upgrade, it's $158 if you want the XLR, or it's the full combination if you want all three, or all two technically. And so whether or not that's a worthwhile upgrade, that's a whole nother question for me. The good news is though that if you want to just start with a more comfortable budget, you can absolutely buy yourself the AKM socketed like I've got here with just the regular original op amps, don't pay anything extra. And for $310 US, you're going to have a really lovely DAC. Again, it's not setting the world on fire, it's not punching way above its price point, but it's good enough that you're really going to enjoy your sound. And then the good news is if you do want a nice incremental step forward with it down the track, then you can always buy yourself a set of the SS3602s, plug them in, and away you go with an even more enjoyable sound, incrementally improved, but still more improved. Now for anyone wondering, I also did play around with the Burson Audio V6 Vivids, and it was a really nice addition in here, but the one drawback is they're too tall to actually fit inside the case. So once you've installed a V6 Vivid in here, you can't slide the board back into the aluminium case, or the wooden case for that matter. I did try both. And so you'll either have to find some kind of adapter to bend it over on a 90-degree angle, or you're going to have to modify your case, and I'm going to leave that up to you to work out. The good news though is that if you do buy yourself a J2 socketed, you can experiment with all different op amps and play around to your heart's content. And so at this point, I felt like the Sparkos were just a slight upgrade. Whether or not they were $180 worth, if you want to put them in all the sockets, that was another question. But again, I wanted to put it into context. So I thought, let's pull out the DAC-Z6 again, and put what is now closer to a $500 US DAC up against a $500 US DAC. Now that we've got two DACs at basically the same price, I fired up a different track, and this time it was Mankind by Jamie Cullum, jumping between the DAC-Z6 and the J2 AKM socketed with the Sparkos Labs op amps, and it was now much more difficult for me to separate the two. So this test did show me that the Sparkos Labs op amps are a step forward. It closed the gap with the DAC-Z6 for sure, and I found that with this comparison, I had to really go hunting for differences. And the good news is the differences were there, and I think they went in favour of the J2. For me, the sound from the J2 had slightly tighter and better controlled bass, a little bit better punch to the bass because of that tightness, so it was both fuller but also tighter and better controlled. And I also felt like instrument separation was just a little bit better from the J2 with the Sparkos Labs op amps. And so at this point, I would take the J2 AKM socketed with the Sparkos Lab op amps over the DAC-Z6. But then you've got to keep in mind the fact that the interface on the J2 is pretty much non-existent. So that does have to factor in as well. The DAC-Z6 gets very, very close to the maximum quality of the J2 AK4493 version, but it's also giving you a full on-screen menu, it's giving you VU meters, it's giving you just a lovely interface in general. And so you do have to factor all of that in and decide what you're looking for. There's also a headphone output on the DAC-Z6 too. So I don't mean to use this as a way of sort of pushing the DAC-Z6. It's a lovely DAC. It's also not the best DAC either. But my point is that the J2 offers some modularity, some customization, some upgradability, and some tweakability, whereas the DAC-Z6 comes as it comes. You can't change anything about it, but it's got a lovely interface. So you really have to kind of weigh up what you're looking for and what's more important to you. And so at this point, you might be thinking this video is a bit of a bust and I'm not much of a fan of the new J2 or the existing J2s, the socketed J2s, any of the J2s for that matter. You might be thinking that, but that's not exactly what I'm trying to say here. What I'm trying to say here is that I think for the money, the Geshelli Labs J2 range is really solid. I love the fact that they're modular. I love the fact that people can buy at the base level and then gradually add pieces to it in the form of the op amps, etc. I think that's great. The fact you can choose the aesthetics of it is fantastic as well. The fact that they're so compact is brilliant as well. So there's lots about them that I like, but at the same time, I don't think that they're redefining anything about the segment. There's nothing about these that when you compare it, other than the modularity, there's nothing about these that when you compare it to other DACs between $250 and $500 US, there's nothing going on here that I think, wow, that is unique, that's better, it's clear hands down favourite. It just sits alongside some other really fantastic DACs, just with different features and different benefits. However, that all changes when we go to this guy. What we've got here, and you can get this in the aluminium case as well, what we've got here is the AK4499 version. And this is where everything gets turned on its head. The AK4499 chip is a really unique, brand new chip from AKM. As I said before, it's more expensive than your traditional AK4493 type chip, and that's because it uses a pair of chips. It splits the decoding process into the two different chips, where one handles all the digital domain stuff, the other one handles all of the analog domain stuff. Beyond that, as I said before, we're going to have to wait until I talk to Gino and kind of pick his brain a little bit as to exactly what's going on, how the two chips interact, what the benefits are, what's being done differently, etc. But the key thing is it's an innovative and completely different approach to the traditional Delta Sigma DAC. And so I was intrigued to hear if this separation made any difference. If you've followed the channel for any length of time, what you'll know is that I'm generally not a huge fan of Delta Sigma DAC chip DACs. Those that use the regular AKM like the AK4493 or your ES9068s like in the DAC-Z6 from EverSolo, any of those, I find it okay. They do a decent job, but they tend to have pretty flat sound stages. And then they also can be a little bit harsh sometimes, a bit fatiguing sometimes, not always. But generally, I just find them to be solid, decent, but not special. And so I was kind of excited to see if something about the AK4499-4491 combo was able to get more out of a traditional Delta Sigma DAC chip, or, and I kind of expected this to be the case, or if it was just another version of a Delta Sigma DAC chip that just made things more complicated but didn't improve the sound. And so the first test for me was to compare the AK4499 version of the J2 with the AK4493 version of the J2. And I was using Sparkos Labs op amps in both of these to get the maximum possible sound quality. And for this testing, I was using the Linear Tube Audio MZ3 running the ZMF Calderas. The reason I chose this combination was that, again, I had a slight volume variation between these two. I had to do some volume matching with the MZ3, which is great because it remembers the volume level for the different inputs. So I was able to get that right and then really rapidly switch between the two without having to fiddle around matching volumes in between. Playing Wide Georgia by John Mayer from his Live in LA concert, and I immediately heard a clear and obvious difference between these two. Now keep in mind, if you're using exactly the same specs, exactly the same aesthetic design, whether it's the wood case on both, aluminium on both, whatever it might be, you're also going to be spending $180 odd US. I don't know the exact pricing yet, but around about $170 to $180 odd US to get the upgraded AK4499 chip. And that's because it's a more expensive chip. The parts themselves are more expensive. What you're going to get as a result, though, is a completely different sonic experience. The AK4493, like so many other Delta Sigma DAC chips, sounds pretty flat. It's a nice DAC chip for Delta Sigma, but it still has that very two-dimensional soundstage. On the other hand, when you go to the AK4499, now you've got depth, you've got layering, you've got three-dimensionality to both the soundstage, but also the individual sounds themselves seem to have a sense of kind of body, three-dimensionality, and scale. The sound from the AK4499 immediately reminded me of something like a Schiit multibit, a good R2R, or a good chord DAC. What you also get because of that depth and that layering is a greater overall sense of separation between instruments. And there's also more texture and detail across the board as well. Everything, literally everything about the sound improves with the AK4499 version. Listening to Wide Georgia, flipping between the two, when I was on the original AK4493, things sounded good, but it sounded like a recording of a live performance. When I went to the AK4499 version, suddenly every sound within that recording had its own place in space. I could tell that the audience was in one location, John Mayer was in another, the drums were in another, the bass was in another. Everything had a place in a three-dimensional soundstage. It was just such a more engaging and more natural and more true-to-life experience. As patrons on my Discord server will know, I was immediately impressed. I was typing away and sharing with them that I think the AK4499 is the real deal. I think it's a true innovation in an area that I don't think we've had much for quite a long time. And so I'm really excited to see where that chip goes into other products. But for now, what's exciting is you can pick it up immediately within the J2 AKM version. Now, I've got another comparison coming up in just a second with the Bifrost 2 from Schiit, because as I said before, that's what this reminded me of. It gives you that wonderful sense of layering and depth in the soundstage, which is what I love about Schiit multibit DACs. So I will give you that comparison in a second. But before I get there, the other thing I want to talk about is the op amps you use with the AK4499. One of the challenges that we also get with integrated op amp chips is that they also tend to flatten the soundstage. And so what I discovered as I played around with the AK4499 is that you're really going to want to pair that with a set of discrete op amps like the SS3602. And so once again, you can buy it, as I understand it's not on the website yet, but I believe you're going to be able to buy it with the AKM AK449 chip and the stock OPA 1656 op amps. But do be aware that that is probably going to reduce or completely remove potentially any of that sense of wonderful layering and depth that I talked about. Detail and resolution you'll probably retain, but I do think you're going to lose that sense of depth and layering that I was hearing from the AK4499 with the Sparkos op amps. So again, you can buy it as the base version and upgrade them later. There's no problems doing that. But you will want to have the op amps installed, and I say the op amps meaning the SS3602 or some other equivalent discrete op amp. You're going to want to have that installed to really hear what this is capable of. And so that does mean that we're now positioning this in the $700+ range. It's pushing right up there to almost cost as much as the Bifrost 2. That's assuming you've got the Sparkos Labs op amps in all 3 sockets, and then also you've got the USB installed. And at that point, I think my maths had it at $780. So it's becoming an expensive DAC at that point, but it's also performing, based on my early listening, it's performing around about that level. And this leads me to my test alongside the Schiit Bifrost 2 to see if it was actually at the same level, getting close, or even going beyond. Listening to Pick Up Your Broken Heart by Newton Faulkner and listening to the J2 AK4499 against the Bifrost 2, and what I heard was 2 wonderful sounding DACs. The J2 was delivering a wonderful sense of separation in the vocals, the bass was really present, rhythmic, and had a nice sense of rumbled on sustained notes. The guitars were nice and crisp and articulate, and the percussion was crisp and sort of shimmery when it needed to be, but also well controlled. So again, nothing at all to complain about, and right where I'd expect for a top-end DAC like a Bifrost 2, even up there with something like a Gustard R26. I'm not saying it's quite as good as that, I haven't compared them directly, but my point is it's up there with a sound quality alongside excellent DACs that produce depth as well as width and detail. Flipping over then to the Bifrost 2, and it does deliver a slightly different sound. There's a little bit more sense of fullness or richness in the guitar from the Bifrost 2. My initial thought to my ears is that it probably sounded just a little bit more natural and true to life. But again, I don't know what the original recording sounded like, so I can't sit here and say one's right and one's wrong. On this particular track, I happen to enjoy the Bifrost 2, but on a different track or on different gear, there's a chance that I might prefer something else. By the way, I was still using the Linear Tube Audio MZ3 and also the ZMF Caldera headphones. I'd say that tonally, I think the Bifrost 2 is probably 2 or 3% warmer or richer than the J2 AK4499. And what that also means though is that the J2 AK4499 is delivering a little bit more sort of air and texture in the sound. So those of you that kind of like what the Bifrost 2 has to offer but wish it had a bit more texture and air up top, meet the J2 AK4499. This could be the perfect DAC for those of you that wished the Bifrost 2 was a bit more textural, a bit more airy. That's what this is going to give you. On the other hand, I do think the Bifrost 2 might have a slightly better sense of tonality through the mid-range area, and I do find that the soundstage is just a little bit larger on the Bifrost 2 as well. Much like with some of the other comparisons here, I feel like these two are pretty close. I was hunting a little bit to hear these differences. That's not to say that they're insignificant. You can definitely hear the differences when you compare them, but they are close enough together that I wouldn't sit here and say one is clearly the better DAC. So if you prefer the look, the modularity, the general style of the Geshelli Labs J2, then the J2 AK4499 I think is just as good as the Bifrost 2, just a little bit different. And so where all this leaves us, and it's been a bit of a long journey, so thanks for sticking with me, where all this leaves us is that we've got some wonderful options here from Geshelli Labs. As I said before, I don't feel like the J2 is redefining the market or the segment at the base versions level. But as you start to climb up the ranks, they are starting to offer some pretty unique options. And by the time you get to the AK4499 version, it's nothing short of brilliant. The ability to have a DAC with modular op amps, the ability to choose to have it with or without the USB to potentially save some money, that all combines to make an extremely versatile and potentially extremely well-priced DAC if you're looking to match up with levels of performance like, say, a Bifrost 2. Just to put that further into context, what I'm saying here is that if you were to buy yourself a J2 AKM socketed using the 4499 chip, But let's say you know that you don't need to get anything from the RCA outputs, you're only going to use the XLR, then you can actually save yourself $80, or maybe flip that around and maybe you only need RCA and you don't need XLR. You can save yourself $160 off the price of something like a Bifrost 2 and get sound that is equivalent, and for some people, maybe even better. Take that a step further. If you don't need USB, maybe you're feeding a streamer via optical or coaxial into your DAC. Now all of a sudden, you could strip off $160 if you don't need the XLR op amps and another $50. And so now we're talking $210 less than a Bifrost 2 for sound quality that is as good or maybe better depending on your preferences in your system. On top of that, you can get it in this really cool wooden case, which will admittedly add to the price again. But what I'm loving about the J2 range now is just the sheer versatility. You can have it look how you want, you can have it sound how you want with different tweaks like different op amps, and the fact that you can now buy it with a DAC chip that brings it to the level of Schiit multi-bit or good R2R DACs, and you've suddenly got something really interesting and in my opinion pretty exciting. If you were to stack the J2 AK4499 with the A3 Pro amp also from Geshelli Labs as I've got over the back here, what you've got there is a stack for about $1,200 that's going to absolutely stand up to lots and lots of other gear well into the $2,000 price point. It's an absolutely wonderful stack. It looks great together. Obviously, I've got slightly mismatched cases. I happen to like that. You might not. But the point is, they look great together. They're nice and compact, but they're an absolutely astoundingly good sounding setup. And so hopefully you've reached the end of this review at about the same place that I've reached as my process for this review has gone through. And that is that I think the J2 DACs are a good, solid option at around that $300 price point if you're talking the entry levels. I don't necessarily know that I'm a huge fan of the socketed version with the regular DAC chips, but the ability to scale it up to the AK4499 gives you massive range to really tweak and really play depending on your budget. For me, the AK4499 leaps straight up to my absolute recommended top tier recommendations list at around about that $700, $800 mark, and it puts it right alongside the Bifrost 2 as my favorite DAC below $1,000. As I said before, at the time that I'm recording this, and potentially at the time I'm releasing it, the AK4499 version may not be live on the website yet, but be sure to check back regularly if you're interested in this one. It's an absolute scorcher of a DAC, it's an incredible sounding DAC, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's sitting in backorder for quite a long time, because anyone looking for a DAC below $1,000 should absolutely have this on their radar. As always, I've put links down below through to Geshelli Labs where you can pick up any of these options for yourself. They are affiliate links and I thank you deeply for any and all support by buying through those. It makes a huge difference to the channel and the content that I'm able to create. And the other nice thing is you're supporting a wonderful family-owned business in Geshelli Labs. Gino and Sherry have been on the channel before for interviews. As I said, I've got them coming up either again soon or I've just released recently another interview with them. And so make sure you check that one out as well and do support a wonderful group of people making some wonderful audio products. For now though, I hope you found this video useful, helpful and informative. If you have, I'd love it if you hit the like button, and please subscribe and ring the notification bell if you haven't already. I've got some really great content coming down the pipeline. I've got all the new HEADPHONE gear. I've got the EF600, the Aria Organic, the Aria Nano, the Audivina. I've got some great budget headphones, some portable headphones, you name it. I've got all sorts of great gear coming, plenty of amazing content. The Schiit ERD's in the mix as well, the CD transport streaming hub thing. And so make sure you subscribe, ring the notification bell. But for now, let me leave it to the music. So happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.